Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. The story begins with Bert, a gentle, unassuming street person who mumbled to himself and talked to trees. He wasn't an alcoholic, but he hung out at a detox center in Sacramento, where a volunteer named Judy took an interest in him. Judy was overjoyed when she found a home for Bert with a silver-haired grandmother, Dorothea Puente, who ran a tidy boarding house in a blue and white Victorian. Little did Judy know that Puente, just one of the woman's many aliases, would soon become her obsession. By the end of the story, Bert has disappeared, and the cops are digging up 7 corpses from the backyard of the boarding house. Author Carla Norton, author of Perfect Victim, skillfully unfolds the many-layered character of this classic Arsenic and Old Lace-style serial killer. At the pinnacle of her fame and glory, Dorothea was like a junkie with a philanthropic habit. Everyone dipped into her pot and benefited from her largesse. She was ultimately tried on 9 counts of murder and sentenced to death. The book that we're featuring this evening is Disturbed Ground, with my special guest, journalist and author, Carla Norton. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Carla Norton.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Finally, we have you on, and we're going to be able to talk about 2 really, really good books, Disturbed Ground, and then later we will talk about your classic, best-selling book, Perfect Victim. This is an amazing book that I just discovered this year, and we'll be able to share a little bit about that story and that incredible book a little bit later. Now, basically, one of the questions I asked often before, without giving any of this story away, tell us why you decided to write about this story, why this story was compelling to you.
I think when I first heard about it, it was one of those stories that you just don't believe, because
right.
Here it was the capital of California, Sacramento, right downtown in this charming little, Victorian house. They started digging up bodies. And when the story broke, Dorothea Puente had fled town. They didn't know where she was, and they proceeded to unearth 7 bodies from her boarding house garden. It was such a bizarre story that I just couldn't get my head around it. And when I started looking into it, I began to understand kind of the softer human element and how it was that this professional con who'd been getting away with murder literally for years and years and years was finally caught. And I just thought, this is an amazing story. Somebody's going to write about it, and it could be me. So I just dove right in.
Yeah, and you had great instincts, too, in terms of the human side that you would be able to uncover and basically convey in this book here. And you paint a very vivid portrayal of how this happened. First, of course, with Bert Montoya. Tell us about Bert Montoya. This is an incredible story, and I like that you put it at the beginning of the book, and we really got to see who Bert Montoya is. So tell us a little bit about Bert Montoya.
Well, he was a very unlikely fellow to be staying in a detox center. He clearly had mental problems and was a very gentle soul. He literally would give you the shirt off his back. He would help the maintenance guy paint the tables. if he found some money, he would turn it in. He was just a very mild-mannered fellow, but he had, issues. He would speak to the trees. He thought there were spirits talking to him. He didn't really speak English very well. In fact, for years, people didn't think he spoke English at all. But what was interesting about Bert is that Dorothea made a mistake in targeting him, because most of the people that she took into her boarding house and then later killed were people that didn't have family checking on them. And even though Bert didn't have family, he did have a social worker, Judy, who was attached to him. And so Bert was kind of a bad choice for a victim. But let me give you a little bit of history, first of all, because the thing about Dorothea is that she had been a con artist all her life since a very young age. And I like to say if she had been bad-smelling, bearded, and tattooed, she wouldn't have gotten away with this for so long. But she was a white-haired lady who lied that she was older than she was. She told people she was 70, and without her teeth, with her pale skin and her snowy white hair, she could look 70. But, in fact, she was only 59 when she was arrested. And so she played the little old lady role, and no one would have suspected that she was preying upon these needy people. She would meet them at a bar, invite them into her boarding house, find out how much they were getting for their various Social Security, disability, pension checks, whatever, and select her victims.
Well, you say, how could she possibly do that, though? Unlike other people that have pulled this ruse before, taken men in and people that no one's checking on them, what was the treatment of the people, before we get to Bert especially, but what was the treatment at this boarding house? What was the atmosphere that was there for anybody that would have come by and spent a few hours? What would they have seen?
Well, Dorothea was a wonderful chameleon, and she played the part extremely well of the most benevolent landlady you can imagine. She ran a tip-top ship. She cooked big meals, generous meals for all of her boarders. She liked the reputation of being a very generous person, and she would organize the calendar, make sure everybody was going to the doctor at the proper time, arrange for rides for them, and she also controlled all of the medication in the household, and she controlled the mail. So if once somebody started getting their checks delivered to the house, she was the only one who could open the mailbox, and then she would have them sign over their checks to her. And ultimately, after they were deceased, she continued receiving their checks because she buried them in the yard. Nobody knew they were gone. And she would sign them herself over to her. She'd take them down to the corner, to Joe's Corner Bar, where she was well known, and he would cash the checks at a bank and bring back thousands of dollars to her every month. She had really a seamless con going, and she went to church every Sunday. She was very generous. Again, at the bars, local bars, she would sit at a certain corner and chat up some elderly fellow who was in need of a place to live. And by gosh, she had a place in her boarding house that had just opened up, and wouldn't you like to come and see it? And it was, clean, well run. There were no guns being pulled on anyone. It wasn't noisy. She made sure that people got up early. If you missed breakfast, then you didn't get to eat. So she would get up very early in the morning and make breakfast. Before that, she would be gardening, and she did have a remarkably beautiful rose garden. We know now that it was a very well-fertilized rose garden. But she ran things with amazing calm, and even when neighbors would complain about sometimes there would be an odor, she would complain about it too. I don't know where that's coming from. I think that's the neighbor over there. So it's kind of phenomenal that she was able to pull this off for so long. Even her name was a lie. Dorothea Puente, she pretended that she was Mexican, that she was one of 11 children, that they called her the gringa of the family, when in fact she was just, a Southern Californian orphan at a very young age. Dorothy Helen Gray was initially her name. So she, everything about her was a layer and another layer and a layer on top of that of a false identity.
Now, part of the ruse is that she, you said she handled the medication, but she also tried to pass herself off as a doctor, as a retired nurse, as a retired doctor. What were some of the other aliases, or did she just limit herself to medical and false medical backgrounds?
Well, this was what was so interesting about her, is that she was able to read people. So if you were very bright, she wouldn't try to pretend that she was a doctor. Or if she was going to be around you a long time, she would read you and figure out what would work for you. She might say she was a medic when she was in the military. She once sat next to a pharmaceutical salesman for an hour in a bar and talked to him about medications, and he convinced him she was a doctor. She would, credit her lavish gifts on being a retired surgeon to some people. Years before that, I think she was kind of in the Hispanic community, had been known kind of as a healer, that if you had, the flu or a toothache or something, Dorothea can fix you up. And she was known as La Doctora. And in fact, she would host a table at the charity ball. And at one point, then Governor Jerry Brown, who is now, again, California's governor, recognized her and crossed the room to kiss her cheek and ask her to dance, because she had such a reputation of being a very charitable individual within the community. So, it's kind of phenomenal. She, like I say, she went to church regularly, but then she would go from the church almost directly to the bar. She didn't drive, and so she had a taxi driver that she often called, and the taxi driver would take her to the the hardware lumber store, gardening, and she'd buy gardening supplies, soil and lime and plants and all kinds of things for her garden. So she was busy, and even the medications that she cashed or that she had prescriptions for were under two different names, as well as the names of the various people that had lived in her house. So she had identification. I think they found driver's licenses in 5 different names for Dorothea after she was arrested. But in fact, her lies started when she was very young, and I found that one of the most fascinating things about the trial. When she was a young teenager, she went to school in Napa for a short time. She was living then with an older brother, and she told the other kids that she was a Portuguese exchange student. And so she had a little trouble with English, but that she was a mathematical genius. And they were so fascinated by her that they wrote an article about her for the school newspaper. And when the administration read that, of course, they were baffled because they knew she was an exchange student. So these wild fabrications started when she was quite young.
Did she have any criminal background? Did she have any contact with psychiatrists or psychologists at that time of any detail? This
is what's so interesting about Dorothea, is that she had a long criminal background, and apparently was a prostitute at a young age. And then she actually had gone to prison. So she was an ex-con when she was arrested. She shouldn't have been running a boarding house because she was prohibited by her parole from running a boarding house. She shouldn't have been administering medications to anyone, because what she had done before was that she had passed herself off as a home health care nurse, and so then she would be taking care of someone who was sick and elderly, and she stole their jewelry, she stole their checks, and they testified against her. So then she learned that if you leave them alive, you're in danger of going to prison, because during that same period of time, she actually committed her first murder. And this is the one that's the most interesting to me, because Ruth Monroe believed that Dorothy was her friend. The two of them went into business together, and they were running a restaurant. Well, Ruth Monroe was the one that was putting up the money, and large amounts of cash were then disappearing. And Ruth Monroe had a family who did come and check on her. Ruth and Dorothea became roommates, and when Ruth fell ill, her family was very concerned about her, but Dorothea was taking care of her. She assured them that Ruth was going to be fine. She was taking care of her, and the children went home, and then Ruth died very early in the morning, I think at about 5 a.m., and Dorothea called an ambulance and said that her friend had had a heart attack. And when you have an older, overweight woman living with another older woman, you don't imagine that it's a murder scene. And so they took her off and did the autopsy, found that it was not a heart attack, that she had died from a drug overdose. And, of course, by then there was no crime scene. This was 2 weeks later, I believe, and then you have two choices. It's either suicide or it's murder. So they decided it was suicide, and the family never accepted that. But at about that time, Dorothea was arrested and put in prison for drugging and robbing other people who then testified against her. So she had a period of time while she was in prison to think about her mistakes. And when she got out, that's when she started committing more murders. In fact, when she was tried on 9 murder counts, not on 7. There were the 7 bodies found in the yard. But prior to that, there was Ruth Monroe, and then there was a charming older gentleman who wanted to marry her, who wrote to her while she was in prison. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Now, the question I did want to pose was, when the police when they did the autopsy, what drug was used to kill Ruth Monroe, and what drug was then used in when she drugged her other victims?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, with Ruth Monroe, she used acetaminophen, and not everyone realizes that Tylenol, which is acetaminophen, is deadly when used in combination to excess with alcohol. And it's a rather prolonged death, but it affects I can't remember, I think it's your kidneys that shut down. And so she basically poisoned her over a period of time, giving her cream de menthe to drink along with high doses of Tylenol. And yeah, and Dorothea, among her belongings, she had a guide to pharmaceuticals. But what was interesting, because the 7 people that were unearthed from her yard, and let me talk about them for a while. She ran this boarding house. She would meet someone. They would move in. She would take excellent care of them. Everyone would be so impressed. And then they would simply disappear. And a lot of these people were alcoholic, somewhat itinerant, had very little, in terms of means. They were retired. They didn't have jobs. So there was no one to miss them. They didn't have family. And if they disappeared, very few people came asking questions. And if they did, well, people wandered off all the time. So, she would say, I don't know where, Betty went. She was here, and now she said she was going up to Oregon. She'd just make something up. And she would then give away their clothes to charity and bring in someone else. Well, in the meantime, she was always kind of preparing for someone else to be brought into her lair. And what she did was so clever, because she would have these workers come to the house, and she would instruct them.
One thing I found fascinating was the incredible charisma that she had and connections. Where did she get these workers from, ironically?
They were right out of prison. They were halfway house workers, when they've been discharged and they're on parole. And with these people, she swore up a blue streak. I mean, she was an ex-con. She knew how to talk to those people as well. She paid them cash.
And she told them so. And she told them that. He told them that, listen, I can empathize with you guys because I did a stint in prison too.
Yeah. So it didn't matter what rank someone was. She would persuade them that she was, had a lot in common with them. She would tell people that, she was Hispanic if they were Hispanic. She always found some common ground and some way to curry favor. But anyway, you were asking about their medications. Every time someone came to her house, she basically collected their medicines from them. So even if they weren't around anymore, she would still have a supply. And it was very difficult during the trial for the prosecutor to prove that she had murdered these people because they were so decomposed. And that was a really key part of the trial. When you have ill people who have heart conditions and diabetes and are alcoholic and all, you name it, they had all kinds of severe medical conditions. How do you prove that they were murdered? Well, it was very interesting, and I actually have a graph in the back of the book, that one of the drugs that Dorothea had 2 prescriptions for and a big stash of was Dalmane. And Dalmane, when it's administered, very quickly metabolizes into a different chemical compound. So if someone has taken that, within 24 hours of death, there's a marker. You can tell that they took it within 24 hours of the time they were killed. And all of the bodies exhumed had some residue of Dalmane in their system that proved that they'd been administered that drug shortly before their death, whether or not they'd ever had a prescription for Dalmane.
Right. Yeah, she knew her drugs.
She knew her drugs, but she used a whole combination of things, and I believe that she also used alcohol, that she would mix things into an alcoholic beverage and say, drink this, it'll make you feel better. The prosecutor posited that once they were knocked out, that she may have then smothered them. And then she had to have had help to bury them in the yard, I believe, but she wasn't really in a position to say, I didn't do it, but he helped me.
Yeah. Now, there's a good reason, or we've alluded to it, that you include Bert so prominently in this book. And I'm really glad that you did, because sometimes just by virtue of accessibility, you don't really have access like you did with this person, with this gentleman. He's very important, obviously, because it leads to the discovery of this little old grandmothery woman who is connected all through town and is known as this great philanthropic, nice lady. So tell us about Bert Montoya, and get back to where Judy is in his life, takes a liking to Bert, and the incredible journey that he goes through, and the great effort from this Good Samaritan, Judy, and Beth, and a couple other people. But tell us about that incredible journey of Bert in this story.
Well, I'm glad you asked about him, because Bert was unusual, like I say, in that he was not an alcoholic, but he was staying in a detox facility that was run by the Volunteers of America. Everyone just simply called it detox, but it was a big corrugated metal shed or warehouse almost with fluorescent lights that could sleep up to 60 men. And they just had vinyl mats on the floor, a big open room, and run by good-hearted people. And on Sundays they would take busloads of them to church, and they had, I believe they had coffee and, some minor breakfast in the morning. But most of the people then would go home. Bert was one of the few that would come back every night. He would do what they called the walk, and he would walk from the Volunteers of America in the morning to a soup kitchen, I think 2 miles away, and he'd end up back at VOA's detox again at night. And Judy Moyse worked there. She started working there, and her job was to get homeless people off the street. She would find people that maybe they were schizophrenic and they weren't taking their meds, and they just needed some help to get back into some kind of more wholesome situation. But the problem with Bert was that he didn't have any ID, and many people feared that he was illegal and that he would be deported. But he communicated to her that he was American, that he was born in Costa Rica, but he had immigrated. And so she set about trying to find his Social Security card. And it took her months and months of letters and writing, and finally she did find his Social Security card. And the reason that was important was that then he could get some benefits, and that meant he could move out of this very uncomfortable warehouse and into an actual home. And then she started searching around, and Dorothea came with very high recommendations. I mean, there aren't many people that take, basically homeless, mentally ill people. Bert was not an especially attractive man. He was unkempt. And Dorothea took him under her wing. She cleaned him up. She bought him clothes. He started becoming more verbal. She got him to take his medication. And one day, Judy Moyse came over, and she was astonished that he initiated a conversation with her and said, "How are you doing? I heard you were sick." And that was so unlike him, because usually he was very shy, and he would just kind of mumble and hang out in the background. He actually called Dorothea Mama, and she took pride. She was always patting him and talking about how well he was doing. And so he seemed to be the textbook case of, what could happen if someone were put in the right situation. But then something happened that, in retrospect, was really ominous. Around this time, Judy Moyse was busy with other things, and she wasn't checking regularly on Bert. She has a son who has a mental disability, and she had lots of her own problems, and she was working. But during this time, I think perhaps Dorothea saw her window of opportunity. This is also about the time one of her other tenants, Ben Fink, disappeared. And then, inexplicably, Bert left Dorothea's, walked all the way across town, and went back to the Volunteers of America shelter, the detox shelter. And he spoke to a friend of his there who couldn't understand why he had come back. And he said he didn't want to go back to Dorothea's. And his friend said, "But why? I mean, you have your own room, you have a bed, you have hot meals served to you, you've got a TV in your room. I mean, Bert, why wouldn't you want to be with Dorothea?" And Bert didn't articulate really what his concern was. He seemed unhappy, but this worker just couldn't understand. He thought maybe he was lonely or whatever, but he was convinced that there was no way that Bert couldn't possibly be happy back in this corrugated metal shelter with a bunch of snoring drunks when he could have his own room and his own bed and clean clothes. So he took him back. He drove him back to Dorothea's, and Bert stopped him. He asked him to stop and have him dropped off about a block before the house, because he was afraid Dorothea would be mad if she saw him dropped off in this other fellow's car. And that was the last time this fellow saw him. I'm trying to think of his name. I think his name was Chuck or Charlie. And he was quite I won't say tearful, but, regretful later when he realized that was the last time he ever saw Bert. And within a couple of months from that, Bert was gone. And that was when all the dominoes started to fall, because Judy stopped by to visit Bert. Haven't seen him for a while. Dorothea, how's he doing? And Dorothea said, well, he's in Mexico visiting my family. Yes, I took him to Mexico, and they liked him so much they asked him to stay. And perhaps if Dorothea had come up with a better story, she would have gotten away with this. But Judy insisted that he would not be okay in Mexico, no matter how generous her relatives were. He couldn't be getting his Social Security checks, and he needed to come back to the States. And Dorothea then promised, oh, yes, I'll bring him back. He'll be back next week. And when Judy came back next week, he wasn't there. And she made another story. And when this went on, Judy said, well, I'm going to have to call the police. And Dorothea said, no, I'll go down and get him myself. I promise he'll be here Saturday. And when Judy showed up on Saturday, again, he was not there. And again, she had an elaborate story about how some relatives had shown up and, taken him off to Utah. And she kept, weaving more and more elaborate tales. And Judy, unlike many people, was quite persistent. And at one point, one of the other tenants, John Sharp, who was, a man who lived up to his name, he was a pretty sharp guy, pulled Judy aside and said, there's something going on here. He had noticed these long trenches being dug in the backyard, and then he'd get up the next day and the trenches would be filled in, and Ben Fink was gone.
Right.
And so he told her about that, and so she went to the police, and they kind of scoffed at her story that this little old lady was murdering people right in the middle of downtown Sacramento. But then the police went, and they actually brought shovels and asked to dig in the yard. And Dorothea never broke character. She said, oh, yes, that would be fine. I have no idea what's back there. And they started digging, and they found a leg bone, a human leg bone. So they shut down all of the digging. And Dorothea called the Detective Cabrera over and said, am I under arrest? And he said, no. And she said, well, would you mind if I go and have coffee with my cousin? And he said that would be fine. And by then there was quite an audience, I should say. There were a lot of spectators, neighbors. There was police tape. They brought in heavy equipment for the digging. The media had gathered. And Dorothea was the antithesis of understatement. She was there with her pink umbrella and her purple pumps and her red coat, and he escorted her, Detective Cabrera escorted her past all of the media to go have coffee, allegedly. And when they exhumed a body, she was gone. And once they decided they would arrest her, she had disappeared. And that's when they did the all-out manhunt, and they, realized that she was an ex-con, that she'd been conning her parole officers for years, and they didn't know where she was. It was really embarrassing, of course, for Sacramento law enforcement. They watched the airport and the bus station, but what Dorothea did was very clever. They found out later. She took a taxi to a bar in West Sacramento and had a few drinks with a friend, and then she took a taxi all the way to Stockton, which is about 60 miles south of Sacramento. And there she caught a bus and went to Los Angeles. And so she had fled Sacramento, and apparently even called the police and gave them, or had someone give them a false tip that she was in Reno, And so the police were all ready for her to fly into Reno. They had the flights, and of course she was not in Reno. So she was a very clever escape artist, and she probably would have gotten away with it. Shall I continue telling the story? Because it's kind of amazing.
Well, what did lead to her downfall? How long was it before police actually? Well, tell us how police proceed, and then you can tell us how long and how exactly she was apprehended.
Well, initially they took her in for questioning, and she continued with her story that she didn't know what happened to Bert. That she had she had seen her Bert's relative come and pick him up on that Saturday. She continued with this lie, and in fact, she asked one of the other tenants, John Sharp, to lie for her. So he backed up her story. But then what happened was that when she stepped out of the room, John Sharp passed a note to the detective saying she's making me lie for her. And so they, through hand signals, arranged to meet around the corner later. And so the detective picked him up on the corner and questioned him, and he revealed to the police more of what he knew. And he had a room underneath the stairs, and he said that one night he'd heard this thump, 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 thump coming down the stairs. That it was about 2 a.m, and it scared him so much that he couldn't go back to sleep, and he propped a chair against the door. So the police then, that's when they started bringing in the heavy equipment and watching the house, but apparently they didn't have enough to arrest Dorothea at that time. So they continued with the exhumations from the yard, and as I said, they found 7 buried there in what is really not a very big yard. I mean, it's not like it was, an acre in the middle of Sacramento. It was just a regular lot right there on a fairly busy street with a sidewalk and big shady trees. And they were continuing with their all points bulletin. She was all over the news, but meanwhile, Dorothea had fled to Los Angeles, and she just stayed in her hotel room for several days, and then finally she kind of went back to her old routine, what was familiar to her. She decided she needed a drink. She called a taxi. She went to a bar. She sat at the counter. She struck up a conversation with this fellow, and she charmed him completely. She said she had just come into town, and an unscrupulous taxi had driven off with her luggage, and it was getting close to Thanksgiving, and so she chatted up this guy and said she would make Thanksgiving dinner for him, and so they made an arrangement. He was going to come pick her up the next day and take her shopping. And something was eating at him. He thought she kind of looked familiar, and then the news came on, and they had a picture of her. And he thought, she looks like she could be, but gosh, I really don't know, and I'd hate for that really to be her. So what was interesting, he didn't call police. He called the TV station. I think it was CBS. And talked to the reporter, and they talked for quite a while, and the reporter got his address and came with some photographs and called his news team and then called the police. And when they arrested her, she was quite acquiescent, and they flew her back to Sacramento and started these proceedings. No one really could believe that she could have gotten away with it all this time. And I think that was what's so fascinating about this case, is that she was so successful. And you don't think about female serial killers. They're really quite rare. Right. And she was one of the most successful that I know of.
Now, she just stuck to her original story with police when she was questioned that she didn't know where these gentlemen were. She didn't know the whereabouts or what was contained in the back garden. So, and at the same time, are they trying to find anybody that assisted her with, say, the burials?
Well, that was one of the things that was fairly controversial because, yes, she was, a healthy individual. I don't believe she did it on her own. But, you have to be careful who you accuse of being an accomplice to murder. And she just clammed up. She got her attorneys, and the defense put forth the theory that these people just died. She's guilty of illegal burial and stealing their money, but not of murder.
Right.
And no one else was accused of helping her. I mean, I think that there's one fellow who was called her Major Duomo, they called him, who was a good friend of hers. But, again, she wasn't in a position to say, I didn't do it, but he helped me. So since she didn't testify, they didn't bring charges against anyone else. They only brought charges against her. And even then, it was a year-long trial. I felt so sorry for the jurors because it really was a very arduous, ongoing trial. And the prosecutor lost 40 pounds during the whole course of the event. He was working hard.
Now, how important was the fact that there was traces of Dalmane, and of course with Dalmane and its characteristics that could be, again, testified at court through experts. Tell us about the role of Dalmane in this, if any.
Well, that's what was so difficult, that because some of these bodies were extremely decomposed.
Right.
But what the forensic team did was they took extractions from their liver and their brains, and from that they ran it through something called a mass spectrometer that can read all the chemicals that are in the body. And they found a number of chemicals. Dalmane is just the one that was the most significant link. But they found, a whole toxic cocktail of things in these people's bodies. The problem was that there are no studies. You can't murder someone, bury them, and then test them, months or years later to see what the levels are. And so you don't know whether these drugs become more concentrated in the liver and the brain as the body desiccates, or whether they actually dissipate as the body decomposes and pass out with the fluids. And so that was the argument that went back and forth with the expert forensic toxicologist who came on stand and testified, and also why these people's doctors came and testified about their chronic medical conditions. But eventually it became pretty clear, not only from the combinations of drugs that were in their systems. And again, Dorothea was the common link. Even if they had never had a prescription for Dalmane, they would have Dalmane in their systems. And she had at least 2 prescriptions ongoing in 2 different names for Dalmane. And she would hoard them. I mean, if you have 60 pills and then break them up in a glass of bourbon, that's a pretty strong drink. But anyway, the other thing is the manner in which the bodies were buried. They were all wrapped in the same way. They were wrapped in sheets. They had these pads, I think they're called Chuck's pads. They're kind of essentially like a big diaper put over their faces. And then they were wrapped and taped, and then with plastic bags over them. They had lye sprinkled on them. So there were commonalities in the way all of the bodies were prepared for burial, and so there was no no question that it was quite intentional, that they didn't just stumble out into the garden and fall into a hole and get covered with leaves, or and they weren't disposed of in ways that were terribly dissimilar. Although I have to say that the first woman that Dorothea murdered, the first woman who went missing, Betty Palmer, was extraordinary in that she had no head, hands, or feet. And I can only suppose that Dorothea felt that would make her harder to identify if the body was found. And those body parts were never found. I know it's
now. Now, did Dorothea have in terms of how good of an attorney did she have, and how good was the defense that they did mount? Because we're talking about 9 counts. Tell us how good that defense was, or what was the prosecution's. I know that you couldn't say when because of the degradation that happened over this long period of time, but could they draw any, again, circumstantial to a great degree, but could they say anything about the first, again, Debbie Palmer with the hands and head missing, and the lie, which would seem to progress the decomposition radically as well. So tell us how really the prosecution battled against the defense and what the defense really chose to use. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there were 2 defense attorneys, Peter Vlautin and Kevin Climo. So she had 2 public defenders working for her case. And then John O'Mara was the sole prosecutor. And during the course of the trial, they both mounted, massive amounts of evidence and long testimony from all kinds of experts. I think that the question is not, who was a better attorney or who presented the better case, so much as, what was going on in the minds of the jurors, because it really just takes one. And to me, logically, if she murdered one, she murdered them all. And yet the jury found her guilty on only 4 counts. Now, that's kind of hard to fathom, but it came out later that there was one juror who did not believe that poisons and could be pharmaceuticals. And the other jurors could not convince him of that. And so for that reason, and they deliberated for a record amount of time. I'm trying to remember how long it was, how many days. It was well over a month. And they even tried to come back as a hung jury, and the judge asked them to go and deliberate some more. And finally, that's the best they could do. They came back with 4 murder counts. And again, to me, that defies logic. But then I wasn't on the jury, and it only takes one person who's unconvinced to hang a jury. So that's the best they could do. And to me, the saddest thing about that was Ruth Monroe, because she was the woman who her death was ruled a suicide, and she had a very active family who testified, and they were very upset because Dorothy had pretended to be her friend, and their mother would never have committed suicide, and so they never got the satisfaction of seeing their mother's death vindicated. So I think that was extremely hard for them. What's interesting, too, is that for the California court system, once someone is convicted on multiple murder counts, then the trial goes to another phase, which is the penalty phase, and it's a death penalty state. So at that point, there's a shift. Once she had been convicted on those 4 counts, there is a shift towards basically the defense begging for her life. And what was extraordinary about that was that they brought out all kinds of information about her past that I had not been able to unearth. I'd been researching her at that time for, was it 3 or 4 years, because this went on for so long. And I'd found some marriage certificates under different names and different things, but I had not realized that she had such a horrible childhood. And they brought out a forensic psychiatrist to then testify about what Dorothea had gone through as a child, which truly was horrific. I mean, her father died of tuberculosis when she was quite young. There was a house full of children. I'm going to forget now if it was 4 or 6 kids that would be left alone for days at a time. They would, basically be rummaging through garbage cans in the neighborhood, and neighbors would call. And I guess they didn't have child protective services at that time, because these days they would have been taken away from their mother. But her mother was a prostitute. She would bring men to the house, or she would disappear for long periods, and then her mother was killed in a motorcycle accident. And Dorothea, I think, was 9 when she was shipped off to an orphanage, and we can only imagine what happened there. And then after that, that's when she started concocting these elaborate lies. So, she's certainly a damaged individual. And they even brought in a woman. Everyone was astonished that she had a daughter, and her daughter came and testified. She didn't know her mother, of course, but the defense team was able to locate her, and she was quite a sympathetic witness. So they didn't sentence her to death. They sentenced her to life without parole, and Dorothea died, it's almost 2 years ago now, I believe, in prison in Chowchilla.
Now, you talk about this was a death penalty case. What distinguished and you say it only takes one juror to have a hung jury, but what distinguished the 4 murders from the other 5 that they didn't convict on? So what distinguished those murders that they were able to get a conviction of murder from that same jury?
But that was something that all of the people, the press and the observers discussed afterwards, because it was baffling to us. We were so surprised. It seemed to me, and this is just my personal opinion, that the murders that were argued the most rigorously were the ones that were not she was not convicted on, and the ones which seemed kind of obvious and therefore were not debated strenuously in court were the ones that she did get convicted on. So I think that the more controversy there was over these people, or the perhaps more confused,
right.
Or maybe the better the case that the defense made for those cases. But the ones that didn't get a lot of attention in court were the ones she was convicted on. It was unusual. But
forensically, other than what you've just said was a distinguishing characteristic, really, if you can answer this, forensically, was there really anything, more authoritative than the other one? You know what I mean? In terms of those 4 murders, were they clearly more prosecutable, or was it, like you say, maybe a little bit baffling to everybody at the end of it?
I couldn't find any reason. I mean, it just didn't make any sense to me. I wish I knew. I didn't interview that particular juror afterwards. He just kind of disappeared and didn't give interviews. So I don't know. I really couldn't say. But that's a very good question. And someone else might have an idea, but I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Well, the thing is, too, I think with 9, I mean, of course, regrettably, 5 people, 5 families, 5 victims do not have justice, in quotations, from this court case. But at the same time, in terms of prosecution, this person is going to spend the rest of her life in prison, and did. And so 4 out of 9, 6 out of 9, 7 out of 9. If you see what I mean, it's regrettable that you don't get justice for all those other cases, but certainly as long as she's prosecuted and I think then justice is done overall, I would think.
Well, one good thing is that after this, the procedures for regulating boarding houses and also for distributing checks became more stringent. So what Dorothea was able to pull off then wouldn't be replicable today.
Right.
It did wake people up that the system was flawed, and so there were some changes made. And I would hope, and part of what I was thinking when I was writing the book is that I hope that people pay a little more attention and don't just assume that just because someone looks nice that they're going to be taking good care of mom or dad or grandpa. That you need to be a little more suspicious and question people's motives and also their background. It's interesting too, talking to an FBI agent recently, there's kind of a saying that that in terms of serial killers that men kill in the bedroom and women kill in the kitchen. Yeah. And generally, women who are killers generally tend to use poisons as opposed to violent means, and right. So they can more easily disguise the murder as a natural death.
Well, historically, that's what we're finding is that people say, well, there's not female serial killers, and they go, oh yeah, they've been around for centuries, and that's exactly what they're poisoners, and very prolific poisoners as well, and for multiple reasons as well. It would be robbery, it would be 2 or 3 things involved sometimes, so kind of complex killers as well.
Yeah, well, the other thing they say that male serial killers usually target strangers, and that women usually go after people that know and trust them. So that's a cautionary tale right there.
Yeah. Yes, a more intimate evil, we'll say.
Yeah, but she really was a fascinating person because, once she was in prison, she wasn't dangerous. She wasn't the kind of person to be shanking guards or getting in fights. People thought she was innocent, that she shouldn't have been there, and she was very motherly to the fellow inmates, and she was. I think she even did some cooking, and I think she worked in the kitchen.
I was going to have. They should have her in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Well, just get the inmates to test out the food, mind you.
Oh yeah, apparently she had quite the reputation, and in fact, I think someone wrote a book, Dorothea Puente's cookbook. I think it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but because of the, it echoes the Arsenic and Old Lace story.
Right.
There are elements, humorous elements. It's very dark humor, but humorous elements in Dorothea's story.
And so you say she passed away a couple of years ago in prison. In
yes. Yeah. So we can close the chapter on Dorothea, but my book is still out there, which is nice. So Disturbed Ground is it's only available as an ebook. It's out of print, which is kind of a shame because the print book has photographs of Dorothea and some of her IDs and the other people involved in the case, the digging at the yard and the F Street house. Right.
Well, thank God it's made it to ebook, probably because of great sales in the first place. But it lives again. So again, previously to the ebook, the book would just go out of print, and well, that's it. I mean, that would be a real shame. So.
Yeah. I'm glad that it's out in ebook, and well, so is Perfect Victim. That's my other true crime that you mentioned, and then I just came out with my debut fiction, The Edge of Normal, which is inspired by a true story. It's kind of a Elizabeth Smart meets Clarice Starling type story.
Interesting.
So
how nonfiction? How nonfictional is it?
Yeah. You mean how much truth is in the story?
Yeah.
Well, it was inspired by a survivor of kidnapping and captivity. So Perfect Victim is about the victimization of a young woman who was kidnapped. And The Edge of Normal is fiction about a survivor of kidnapping and captivity. So they're kind of mirror images of those stories. But a lot of people ask me about the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction, and the closest I can explain is that when you're writing nonfiction, the story must serve the facts. And when you're writing fiction, the facts serve the story. So you have a different priority when you're writing those kinds of books. You really have to be very careful in writing nonfiction because it's always this little voice on your shoulder that lawyers and doctors and forensic experts are going to be reading your book with a very critical eye. If you get one thing wrong, they're going to throw the book across the room. So you're always very cautious about your credibility. Whereas when you're writing fiction, I've made up a fake town because I didn't want someone saying there's really not an exit there when you go right across the lake. I didn't want people arguing about the facts of the geography.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, with Perfect Victim, normally we just talk about one book, and we have a little bit more time just to talk briefly about Perfect Victim, because I'd like to, I apologize, but I'd like to get you back on just to talk about Perfect Victim, because it's such an incredible book, such an important story. Again, I don't know how on earth I didn't really know about this story. Tell us when this book was published. Tell us when the story actually occurred, at least in terms of the trial, because stories started much before that. But tell us just a little. Tell our audience just a little bit about this incredible case and when it did occur.
Well, that was an amazing story, and at the time, everyone was kind of astonished about it. The headlines went international. Originally, it was a kidnapping that happened in 1977. A 20-year-old hitchhiker was picked up by a man and his wife and their infant. It looked very safe, but he was actually looking for a sex slave. And he abducted her in a very grisly manner and held her captive most of the time in a box for 7 years. When she was released, she and the wife fled together, and the trial was in 1985. And so it was a case that it was so unsettling because it's about brainwashing or captivity syndrome, Stockholm syndrome, mind control, coercion. You can use a lot of different terms. But it was so unsettling, I thought nothing like this would ever happen again. And then, of course, there have been the 3 women just actually a year ago today, the 3 women in Cleveland who were discovered. The J.C. DeGard case, which is just absolutely startling to imagine anybody held for 18 years. The Elizabeth Smart case is the one that has, I really think, caught public attention. She was held for 9 months, but she was such a sympathetic and inspiring young woman that she has really, I think, taught the public a lot about not only about what a victim goes through, but what a survivor must do to overcome that kind of ordeal. And she's a real advocate for something called RAD Kids, for teaching kids self-defense to fight off abductors. In any case, Perfect Victim, when it came out, because it discusses these mind control issues that were not well understood, it was picked up by the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit and put on their reading list. And the book came out and was on the New York Times paperback nonfiction bestseller list for 18 weeks. It was number one on that list for 4 weeks, and it's never gone out of print. It's still something that I think every time there's a horrific kidnapping story, that there's another resurgence of interest in the story. And I'm very glad that I have maintained contact with the victim of that story. She's alive and well. There's not a lot of blood on the walls. It's not a grisly murder, but it's psychologically, I think, just a fascinating story and an astonishing crime.
You know, and the thing is, too, what I see a lot of reviews of books, and there are certain camp of true crime readers that they're the dedicated true crime reader that love the entire book. And then there's these other people that say, well, I didn't like the trial. Well, this trial is incredible because not only of the information that comes out at trial, but for this woman that's been held in captivity for 7 years to now have to answer, to now have to be cross-examined, now has to, been shut away from society and her family and everyone else with these threats. Now it has to go to court, and it's just an incredible viewpoint that you put the reader in to be able to get this incredible landmark trial, and to really, by virtue of your entire book, Perfect Victim, to understand this Colleen Stan, Jan Hooker, and Mr. Hooker, I guess, to a great degree. The book, when it's different from those other cases, and again, before this time, the public really only knew about the Patty Hearst case, and I mean, that is a confusing case because Patty Hearst, of course, goes on to do some crime under the tutelage of her abductors. So this story that you have is just, again, a psychological thriller. It really is. I'm not overstating this, and it's, again, that's why I wanted to have you on when talking about Disturbed Ground, but Perfect Victim, I just got to extol the virtues of how great this true crime book is. It's one of the most unique and incredible books, so I just want to thank you for this interview about Disturbed Ground, but also, I got to have you back on to talk specifically about Perfect Victim.
Oh, thank you, Dan. Thank you. I really appreciate those comments. I'm glad you like the books, and thank you for reading both of them. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I'd love to speak to you again.
Yes. The other thing is that the Perfect Victim is also, again, the incredible access you have is by virtue of having the prosecutor at least helping with this book. And so together this book has this, again, an access to some information that you really don't get with most true crime books. So.
Yeah, we collaborated on the book. She prosecuted the case, and then we worked on the book after the trial. And I really did want to put together the problems that she had in prosecuting it and answer those questions with the facts of the case. But it was a real education for me as well, because there are all kinds of legal issues that aren't necessarily apparent in the courtroom, but that were a real conundrum. And when you bring up Patty Hearst, I mean, yes, she was tried for crimes that she committed after she'd gone through this very intense indoctrination and had taken essentially a slave name. And so there are similarities between those two cases. And then once again, it was the same courtroom, the same state, and people didn't believe that Colleen Stan had been held captive by Cameron Hooker for all those years against her will. And it was partly because they didn't understand the mind control issues and how you go about subverting someone's will over a very intense period of time of torture and deprivation.
What you also include, too, is just a little bit of information about a classic fictional book that I guess was, was inspiration to serial killers like the subject of Die For Me, Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, but specifically Leonard Lake. and he had a little same kind of dream as Mr. Hooker, little cell underneath his home where he would have a sex slave, and he utilized his own family, girlfriend, daughter, and friend into this abduction and enslavement of his victim. So I thought it interesting that you included a little reference as well. And again, this John Fowles it's a fictional account, but
you're talking about The Collector. Yeah, The Collector.
The Collector, yes, absolutely. And so you see a connection with the most sinister type of, I think, from all the true crime that I've read, when you get a couple, a man and wife, a girlfriend, boyfriend, two men, but especially a man and wife, abducting people and enslaving them, and the contract that she believed that she was signing, this incredible horror that this woman was subjected to. And then if you think, geez, how could it get any worse? Well, now you have a trial. And it isn't black and white. It isn't an easy conviction. People are not familiar with this. They actually can't believe this. And as far as a defense attorney, he's a really good, dedicated attorney that's giving a very, very vigorous defense to his client.
Yeah, I poor Colleen to have to go through that. But you're right. I mean, we had no idea which way the verdict would go, because it was such a peculiar case, and it had gone on for so long, and there was really no precedent for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks to a savvy publisher and to dedicated people like yourself, and is it Christine McGuire was the prosecutor?
Yes.
Is that the name? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. And so you came up with a fantastic book that I highly recommend, and so thank you very much. And thank you for this interview about Disturbed Ground. Thank you, Carla Norton, for coming on and spending some time with us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. You have a good evening.
You too. Good night.
Bye now.